10 years ago, a mother and daughter vanished in the woods. No blood. No footprints. No bodies. The case went cold, until a dog named Bandit caught the scent no one else could. Ashwood, Oregon, was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked and knew which neighbor borrowed their lawnmower last. Nestled in the shadow of the Willamette National Forest, it was a postcard-perfect place where nothing much ever happened, until it did. Detective Sawyer hadn't meant to end up in Ashwood. After losing his daughter to a drunk driver 3 years earlier, he'd walked away from city life, from high-profile cases, from everything. He traded the sirens of Portland for the silence of Pines. The department was small, the pay modest, but it offered him one thing no big city could: distance. Bandit was the only partner he'd ever fully trusted. The 95-pound German Shepherd had a nose like a miracle and a bite like hell. They worked in quiet sync, like a married couple who didn't need to speak to know what the other was thinking. Sawyer didn't believe in psychics, ghosts, or signs, but sometimes he wondered if Bandit knew more than most humans. It was late October when the call came through. Sheriff's office had reopened some of the older missing persons cases for digital archiving, and one of them, case #WPD 317, had no digital file at all. Sawyer scrolled through the yellowed case folder in his hands, sipping black coffee on the back steps of the precinct. Missing: Sandra Webb, 37, and daughter Lucy Webb, 11. Last seen, August 17, 2013. Location: Trailhead, Blue Pine Access, Willamette National Forest. Status: presumed dead, no remains recovered. The photo hit him hardest. Sandra had warm, chestnut hair and wore a teacher's smile. Lucy looked just like his daughter Emma. Same curious eyes, same crooked teeth, same too-big-for-her-face hiking backpack. It was the kind of picture that didn't belong in a file marked cold case. "Hey, Bandit," Sawyer said, crouching down. The shepherd looked up, ears pricked. "How do you feel about ghosts?" Bandit tilted his head, then barked once, sharp and certain. The next morning, Sawyer checked out a marked cruiser and loaded Bandit into the back. The trailhead was 46 miles northeast of Ashwood, a route carved through steep switchbacks and moss-draped trees. Fog rolled through the canopies like breath from a sleeping giant. They arrived at the Blue Pine Access lot just before 9 a.m. It hadn't changed much in 10 years, still just a gravel patch and a wooden signpost with faded trail maps. Only 6 cars sat in the lot. Back in 2013, there had been 8. No one remembered a red Honda Civic parked here with a woman and child inside. Bandit leapt from the vehicle and began circling immediately, nose low to the ground. Sawyer scanned the area, then looked toward the trailhead. Let's see what they missed. 3 miles into the hike, Sawyer felt it in his gut, the uncanny quiet. No birdsong. No wind. Just the crunch of pine needles underfoot. Bandit paused suddenly, nostrils flaring. He veered off the trail, cutting through thick underbrush, pause quick but deliberate. Sawyer followed, pushing aside branches, boots catching on gnarled roots. After about 300 yards, Bandit stopped at a shallow indentation in the earth. A shoe. Children's size. Purple canvas, the kind with glow-in-the-dark laces. Almost untouched by weather. Sawyer crouched. Lucy's? There was no way to be sure yet, but he pulled out a Ziploc evidence bag anyway. Bandit wasn't done. He sniffed along a fallen log, then let out a low, growling bark. 10 feet ahead, hidden beneath pine needles and soil, something jutted out, frayed green nylon. Sawyer used his gloves to brush it away, revealing the corner of what looked like a collapsed tent or tarp. Old. Torn. Smelled like mold and rot. He stood, heart pounding harder than it should have been. "You really want to keep going?" he asked Bandit. Bandit gave a short, tense bark. He was locked in. Sawyer didn't believe in fate. But this This felt like something wanted to be found. Back at the station, Sawyer filled out the initial report but held back from filing it officially. The shoe wasn't logged in the original evidence list. Neither was the tarp. That meant one of two things: either the search teams missed it, or someone didn't want it found. He scanned through the list of people interviewed in the original case: the ex-husband, alibied, forest rangers, hikers. Then, he saw the name Ezekiel Marr. A woodsman, who lived alone in a cabin 30 miles off-grid. Claimed to have seen Sandra at the library once. Described by social services as a spiritual isolationist and former cult member. But Ezekiel was dead, apparent suicide in 2016. Case closed. Or was it? Sawyer called the county records office. "You guys still have Ezekiel Marr's belongings and evidence?" "For boxes," the clerk replied. "Mostly old rope, journals, survival gear." Rope. Sawyer's spine stiffened. He remembered something from the file. Sandra and Lucy were believed to be camping, but no camp was ever found. No rope. No gear. Nothing. Until now. 2 days later, Sawyer sat in the evidence locker going through Ezekiel's journals. The man's handwriting sloped wild and uneven, scrawled across the margins. August 10, 2013, she wants to give her child a purer life. I will show her the path. August 17, the forest accepts them. The girl will remain untainted. Sawyer felt bile rise in his throat. Bandit growled from his spot beside the desk. "No kidding, boy," Sawyer whispered. This guy was off his damn rocker. In the last journal entry before Ezekiel's suicide. "They'll come looking again. But by then, I'll be gone. And the pure will rest in silence." That night, Sawyer couldn't sleep. Not just because of the case, but because of what it stirred in him. Emma would have been 11 this year. Same age as Lucy. Same love for butterflies and drawing horses and eating cereal dry, straight from the box. He rubbed his temples, then looked down at Bandit curled at his feet. "You think we're chasing ghosts, or truth?" Bandit didn't move. But his tail thumped once against the floor. That was enough. By sunrise, Sawyer had packed their gear and mapped the trail back to the discovery site. But this time, they weren't stopping at the shoe. They were going deeper, where no ranger had gone in 10 years. Where no search dogs had sniffed. Where the truth waited, hidden beneath roots and bones and silence. Because something terrible happened out there. And Bandit had just picked up the scent. The sun hadn't yet burned through the thick morning fog when Sawyer parked the cruiser just off the fire road near Blue Pine Trail. This time, he wasn't interested in following the official hiking route. He and Bandit had come prepared, to go deeper, further, and darker than any search team had dared 10 years ago. Sawyer adjusted his backpack, strapped with supplies, a compact shovel, field gloves, and evidence bags. He clipped a body cam to his vest, powered it on, and gave a short nod to Bandit. "Let's go find her." Bandit's tail gave a small wag, but his eyes were sharp. Focused. The shepherd was already sniffing the air as if memories from a decade ago were somehow still swirling in the damp forest air. They hiked for over an hour, veering away from the trail and crossing into rugged terrain blanketed with pine needles and thorny brush. Bandit moved with purpose, nose low, ears twitching. About 1.5 miles in, he stopped. At the base of a fallen tree, he began to dig furiously, kicking up clumps of soil. Sawyer knelt beside him, pushing aside moss and brittle leaves. That's when he saw it, a strip of weathered fabric, half buried. Sawyer pulled gently. A tattered child's hoodie. Purple. Faded butterfly pattern across the front. Right sleeve partially torn, as if snagged on something. Sawyer's throat tightened. Lucy's. He sealed it in an evidence bag, marked the GPS coordinates, and took a moment to steady himself. Bandit hadn't moved on. He was staring ahead, toward a dense copse of trees and a narrow ravine cloaked in shadows. Then he growled. The ravine was steep and lined with loose stones. Sawyer followed carefully, slipping twice before reaching the bottom. Bandit paced in tight circles, whining softly. That's when Sawyer noticed the depression in the earth, just large enough for a body. No bones. No gear. But something had been there. Recently or not, he couldn't tell yet. Beside it, half covered in ferns, was a rusted metal lunchbox. Sawyer pried it open carefully. Inside was a water-damaged notebook with a plastic unicorn sticker peeling from the cover. He opened it and stared. Childlike handwriting. Doodles of flowers, hearts, and mountains. Then, halfway through, a sentence in shaky block letters. Mom says we're staying longer. The forest is good for me. Page after page described hikes, meals by the campfire, a man with crazy eyes and stories about light. And then. He scares me now. He watches us at night. I heard Mom crying. I miss Grandma. Sawyer snapped the book shut. His stomach churned. They weren't just lost. They were trapped. Back in Ashwood, Sawyer placed the hoodie and the notebook into evidence, logged with photographs and preliminary notes. He didn't file the report just yet. Something told him this case still had secrets to give. He returned to the records office, determined to find anything on Ezekiel Marr the original investigators may have missed. He found it in a dusty cardboard box labeled, Supplementals, 2014. Inside was an unlabeled VHS tape with a yellow sticky note, Marr, old news segment. He borrowed the department's VCR and played it in the briefing room. The footage was grainy. A local TV anchor stood in front of a county courthouse. In 2010, following the shutdown of the Children of the Pure Light religious commune in West Virginia, former members dispersed across the U.S. One such individual, Ezekiel Marr, has been under scrutiny following allegations of child endangerment tied to the group's radical beliefs. The camera cut to a photo of Marr, long beard, sunken eyes, military jacket. The reporter continued, Marr, now residing off-grid in Oregon, refused interview requests. Former cult members say he believed children were spiritually cleaner than adults, and that city life tainted the soul. Sawyer felt ice down his spine. That cult wasn't just a footnote, it was motive. That night, he returned to his house with Bandit by his side. Rain fell softly on the roof. He couldn't stop thinking about the notebook. About Lucy, scribbling her fears while the forest closed in around her. He opened the files again, looking for overlooked threads. A line in the original 2013 interview with Sandra's mother caught his eye. Sandra had been talking to a man from the library about natural education. She wanted to get Lucy out of the city. That matched what Marr wrote in his journals. Sawyer leaned back. He didn't take them by force, he whispered. He convinced her to come. Which meant, there could be more victims. More mothers. More children. Bandit, curled near the fire, suddenly lifted his head and growled softly at the door. Sawyer stood, hand on his sidearm. He opened the front door slowly. Nothing. Just fog and pine. But that growl, Sawyer had learned never to ignore it. The next morning, he returned to the evidence locker with a new objective. He requested all DNA samples pulled from the rope used to bind the remains found in 2016, presumed to be Ezekiel's practice gear at the time. Newer tech had made strides since then. The lab tech, a young woman named Krista, nodded thoughtfully. If we find skin cells or follicle traces, I can cross-match with the sample from Lucy's toothbrush, she said. Do it, Sawyer said. And run it against the hoodie and notebook too. Anything. She paused. Detective, you think there are more? He nodded grimly. I think we've just scratched the surface. Back on the trail later that day, Sawyer and Bandit returned to the ravine. This time, he had a hunch. He followed a small creek downhill. Bandit picked up a scent and pulled hard to the left. They reached a natural rock shelf. Bandit barked, then began pawing at the ground furiously. Sawyer dug carefully and hit metal. An old camping pot, sealed tight. Inside, a melted candle, a charm made of twine and feathers, and, worst of all, a locket with a child's photo. Not Lucy. A different girl. And that changed everything. Sawyer sat on a tree stump, staring at the small locket in his gloved hand. Bandit sat beside him, panting quietly, his eyes never leaving the forest line. This wasn't just about one child. Ezekiel Marr had turned this forest into his sanctuary, his altar, and quite possibly his hunting ground. The ritualistic setup, the old rope, the notebook entries, it all pointed to something deeper than delusion. It was ideology. And for the first time in years, Sawyer felt the old burn in his gut, the one that used to keep him chasing down monsters. Bandit nudged his knee. Yeah, boy, he whispered. We're not done. The rain had passed, but the earth still carried its weight. Mud clung to Sawyer's boots as he and Bandit pushed deeper into the forest, far off any map trail. The air felt thick with something more than moisture, something older. The further they walked, the more the woods began to change. Branches knotted tighter overhead, forming a loose canopy that filtered out the morning sun. Roots jutted from the soil like twisted veins, and even Bandit's usually confident stride became cautious. This wasn't just another part of the woods. It felt untouched. Sawyer paused to check his GPS. No signal. Not surprising out here, but it made him uneasy. He glanced at Bandit, who was sniffing the wind, ears pinned forward. You smell something? Sawyer whispered. Bandit responded with a low growl, then turned sharply and moved downhill, toward a narrow ravine thick with pine needles and damp moss. It took Sawyer 20 minutes to catch up, sliding down slippery embankments and ducking beneath broken limbs. When he finally reached the bottom, Bandit was standing completely still, tail stiff, staring at a moss-covered mound tucked between two boulders. Sawyer moved closer. At first, it looked like nothing, just more debris from a storm or maybe an old tree root. But as he swept his flashlight across the mound, something green glinted beneath the rot. He crouched, brushing away the moss and decayed leaves. A tarp. Frayed, mildewed, and sun-bleached beyond recognition, but still intact enough to recognize as camping gear. Sawyer's pulse kicked up. Bandit barked twice, short, sharp, urgent. Sawyer stood and scanned the surroundings. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just abandoned gear. It looked intentionally covered. Hidden. His breath came slower now. He crouched again and carefully pulled back the tarp. Underneath it lay the crushed remains of a small two-person tent, the poles snapped and the fabric slashed in places. Inside were fragments of synthetic material, what looked like part of a sleeping bag, and, just barely poking from the dirt, a rusted camping pot. He bagged it all. Every piece. Then he found the biggest clue yet. Just outside the tent, maybe 6 feet away, Bandit began digging in the mud near a flat stone. As dirt sprayed, Sawyer moved to his side. Within seconds, Bandit uncovered a child's sketchbook, half decayed, its cover swollen from water damage. Sawyer opened it carefully. Most of the pages were smeared with age, but one drawing remained. A crayon sketch of a woman and a girl, holding hands beside what looked like a pine tree. Above them, someone had scribbled a name in a child's handwriting, Lucy plus Mom, camping day. Sawyer's hand tightened around the notebook. His throat felt raw. She was here, he whispered. Back at the precinct, Sawyer laid the items out on a clean table under the evidence lights. His mind was running too fast to sit still, so he paced as the evidence techs began documenting and bagging the findings. A young deputy leaned over the sketchbook. "You think it's real?" Sawyer nodded slowly. "No doubt. That notebook didn't come from a hiker. That's Lucy's. The tent, the pot, the drawing, it all suggested that Sandra and Lucy had at least made it to camp. But it didn't explain why they vanished without a trace. No blood. No signs of struggle. Just silence." Sawyer pulled out the map again. He circled the ravine and the narrow pass leading to it. There were no recorded trails here, not even animal paths marked in ranger databases. "This spot wasn't found by accident," he muttered. "Whoever brought them here knew exactly where they were going." That night, Sawyer sat in his kitchen with Bandit lying under the table. Rain ticked softly against the windows. The heat from his untouched coffee had long since faded. He stared at the sketchbook. If they'd made it this far, what had gone wrong? Had they trusted someone? He thought back to Ezekiel Marr, the hermit who'd written about purifying the girl. He had to be involved. But Ezekiel had died years ago. If he'd killed them, why hide it all so carefully? Sawyer stood and walked to his garage, where he kept a box labeled Emma. Inside were old school papers, scribbled drawings, and one sketchbook almost identical to the one they found. He opened it and ran his finger across the drawings. Butterflies. A tree. A woman and a girl holding hands. He felt something shift inside. This wasn't just a case anymore. It hadn't been for a while. The next morning, Sawyer met with the county forensic analyst, Dana Temple. She had already run a preliminary analysis on the pot and tarp. "The fibers are consistent with camping gear manufactured between 2010 and 2013, she said, scrolling through her report. "There's slight soot residue on the pot, could indicate it was used on a fire." "What about DNA?" She nodded. "We lifted partial prints on the inside of the sketchbook. Too degraded for identification, but it matches the pattern size for a child under 12. Sawyer sighed. Not a confirmation, but another piece that pointed to the same truth. Then Dana pulled up something unexpected. "We found animal bones arranged in a circle near the tarp, just a few feet away. Looked almost ritualistic. Intentionally placed." Sawyer froze. "Like an altar?" "Could be." He didn't say it out loud, but a sick knot twisted in his gut. Ezekiel Marr's journals had mentioned rituals of cleansing. Was this where he had planned to carry them out? He looked over at Bandit, who was resting calmly beside the evidence room door. "You found it, boy," Sawyer said softly. "You found where it all started." Later that day, he and Bandit returned to the site to scan a wider area. It was foggy again, but the trail had been marked from their last visit. Sawyer used orange tape on nearby branches to guide the return trip. Bandit led confidently now, nose low, tail high. Near the boulder where they'd found the tarp, Bandit veered again, growling. His fur bristled. He had found something else. Sawyer hurried to his side and saw it, a small wooden carving, shaped like a tree, with a name scratched crudely into the back, Lucy. It had been wedged into a crevice between two rocks, almost like someone had placed it there as an offering. Sawyer bagged it immediately, then sat down on the cold ground next to Bandit. "This was no accident," he muttered. "This place, it was chosen." Bandit let out a low whine and nudged his hand with his nose. They sat in silence for a moment longer. Something terrible had happened here. But Bandit had found the path. Now it was up to Sawyer to follow it to the end. It was just after 6 a.m. when Sawyer turned the key in the ignition of his Ford Bronco, Bandit already in the passenger seat, ears alert. They had a long drive ahead, through winding dirt roads that cut through the thick Oregon wilderness, toward a rotting cabin that once belonged to a man named Ezekiel Marr. The name had haunted Sawyer since he'd read the journal entries. The kind of man who referred to a child as untainted didn't belong in the woods, or among people. The drive to the property took almost 2 hours. The deeper they went, the more the road turned to gravel, then mud, until it was barely a road at all. Trees bent overhead like archways, filtering sunlight into a gray, eerie haze. "Looks like hell finally grew a beard," Sawyer muttered as the truck rumbled to a stop in front of the cabin. The place was falling apart, roof caved in on one side, windows shattered, moss hanging from the rafters. But Sawyer didn't care about appearances. What mattered was what might still be inside. Bandit jumped down and immediately began sniffing the area, weaving between stacks of firewood and rusted buckets. Sawyer stepped carefully through the creaking doorway, hand resting on the grip of his holstered sidearm, just in case. Inside, it smelled of mildew, dust, and old rot. The living space was one open room, kitchenette, bed frame without a mattress, desk littered with scraps of paper and wax-dripped candles. Sawyer pulled on latex gloves and started digging. In the far corner, under a moldy tarp, he found what he was looking for: boxes. Labeled Evidence, Mar, Ezekiel, transferred from the county storage 3 years earlier when the sheriff's office had done an archival purge. Turns out, the cabin had never been cleared out. Just locked and forgotten. He pried open the top box. Rope. Not just any rope, 8mm nylon cord, pristine in parts, frayed in others. He knew the make from the lab's earlier report: Sterling Rope Company, used by climbers, rescue workers, and apparently by fanatics who believed children needed cleansing. Bandit let out a low growl from the back corner of the room. Sawyer followed his lead. There, tucked behind a cabinet, was a wooden crate, old but intact. Inside were 6 dolls, each one with its eyes gouged out and hair unevenly chopped. Their clothing was shredded, singed in places, like someone had tried, and failed, to burn them. But it was what lay beneath the dolls that turned Sawyer cold. A map. Hand-drawn, yellowed at the edges. And marked with circles, 3 to be exact. One of them aligned perfectly with where Lucy's shoe had been found. Another was close to where Bandit had uncovered the tarp. And the third, well, the third was deeper. Much deeper. A place Sawyer had never seen on any official trail map. The Hollow of Cleansing, it was labeled in red ink. His skin crawled. He looked at Bandit. "I think we just found your next scent trail, partner." Back at the station, Sawyer laid the map flat on the evidence table, cross-referencing it with updated satellite imaging. The third marked location was near a limestone bluff, nestled between 2 creek beds and blocked by boulder formations. A place no hiking group would ever go. Too remote. Too hidden. He called in a request for a drone flyover from the forestry division. But it would take days. Sawyer wasn't waiting. He packed light: 2 energy bars, a thermos of coffee, flashlight, gloves, GPS, and a field first aid kit. Bandit traveled even lighter, just his vest and nose. They set out before dawn. The hike took longer than expected. No real trail, just deer paths and brush so thick Sawyer had to hack through it with a folding blade. Bandit moved ahead with a kind of urgency Sawyer hadn't seen since his early service days. The dog was locked in. They crossed over a ridge of jagged rock, skirted a muddy slope, and descended into a shadowed hollow that seemed cut off from the world entirely. That's when Bandit stopped, his body rigid, hackles raised. He let out a sharp bark and started digging under a cluster of deadfall. "Easy," Sawyer whispered, hand on his sidearm. And then, Bandit unearthed a mason jar. Inside it, curled scraps of paper, what looked like dried herbs, and, God help him, a child's tooth, yellowed with age. Sawyer stood frozen for a moment, then dropped to one knee. He pulled out the jar, bagged it, and looked back at Bandit, whose tail was still stiff, his nose pressed to the ground. There was more. 10 feet farther, partially hidden beneath a rock ledge, was another bundle, this one wrapped in waxed canvas. Inside, a tattered child's drawing. It showed two stick figures, one tall, one short, standing next to a big tree. Above them, written in messy crayon, was the name Lucy. Sawyer didn't cry much anymore. Not since Emma died. But for a second, the air felt heavier than the mountains around him. This wasn't a theory. This wasn't a cold case file. This was real. A child had died here. And the earth still remembered. He looked around the hollow. The silence wasn't natural. It felt like something sacred had been broken here, something pure, twisted into something vile. He marked the GPS coordinates and snapped photos of everything. The jar. The drawing. Even Bandit, who stood like a statue over the spot, as if waiting for a command only he could hear. Back at the station, the forensic team confirmed the jar contained dried lavender and sage, often used in purification rituals. The paper held scribbled Latin phrases, translated to, "The child must not be touched by the city's filth." The tooth? Human. A deciduous molar, likely from a girl aged 10 to 12. Sawyer sat with that news for a long time, staring out the window as Bandit slept on the floor. Ezekiel Marr was dead. Had been for years. But the trail he left behind? Still warm. The sky turned a dull steel gray as Sawyer and Bandit reached the edge of the mapped terrain. Here, the trail disappeared entirely. No more switchbacks. No more worn-down logs or hiker cairns. Just the forest, raw, tangled, untouched. Sawyer checked the GPS again. Nothing. Even the offline topographic map showed blank space. This was the part of Willamette National Forest people didn't hike through. Hell, most didn't even know it existed. Bandit paced ahead, tail stiff, nose low. His paws barely made a sound on the moss-covered ground, but every few feet he would pause, sniff, and give Sawyer a hard glance. Keep up. The deeper they went, the more the silence pressed in. No birdsong. No wind. Just the thud of Sawyer's boots and the occasional twig snapping beneath Bandit's step. Then they found it. It wasn't marked by a sign or even a worn path. Just a narrow corridor between two jagged rock formations, like the woods had split open to reveal a secret. Bandit stopped, nostrils flaring, and let out a low growl that came from somewhere deep in his chest. "You smell it, don't you?" Sawyer murmured. He did too. A thick, metallic stench beneath the earthy rot. Like old blood soaked into stone. He unholstered his sidearm and clicked on his flashlight. "Let's see what's hiding, partner." The rock corridor opened into a shallow ravine cloaked in shadow. At its lowest point, wedged between two large boulders, was a narrow fissure barely 3 feet wide. Bandit barked sharply, startling a few crows from the trees above. Sawyer crouched near the opening. The stench was stronger now, so strong it burned the inside of his nostrils. He tied a bandana over his face, then reached in with his flashlight. That's when he saw it. A bundle. Wrapped in a faded, mold-stained sleeping bag, tied tight with thick nylon rope. One corner had torn open, exposing something white and porous. Bone. Sawyer's stomach dropped. He called it in immediately. "No names yet," he told dispatch. "But it's them. It has to be." They didn't sleep that night. Sawyer and Bandit set up camp on higher ground, far enough from the fissure that they could breathe. He built a small fire but couldn't bring himself to eat. Bandit lay near the edge of the light, ears alert, growling every time something rustled in the trees. Sawyer reviewed the evidence in his head, the journals, the rope, the entries about the girl and the path to purification. This wasn't just murder. This was ritual. By dawn, the forensic team had arrived, 2 detectives, a medical examiner, and a crime scene tech named Ellen who had a pit bull patch stitched onto her backpack. Bandit stayed close to Sawyer but growled at the new arrivals. Not out of aggression, more like warning. "Easy, boy," Sawyer said, resting a hand on the shepherd's shoulder. "They're here to help." Dr. Chen, the lead me, suited up and entered the fissure first. She didn't come back out for nearly 30 minutes. When she emerged, her face behind the respirator was pale and damp with sweat. "There are 2 sets of remains," she confirmed. "An adult female and a juvenile. Both wrapped together. Both tied." Sawyer nodded, jaw clenched. "That's what we expected." "No," Chen said, her voice quieter. "You don't understand. There's more." 10 feet from the fissure, buried beneath a thin layer of brush and leaves, they found a ring of small animal skulls, arranged in a perfect circle: raccoons, squirrels, birds, all whitened by time. In the center sat 3 children's dolls, stripped of their clothing, faces scorched and missing eyes. Nearby hung a necklace made of human teeth, strung on fishing wire. 27 teeth in total. 18 were baby teeth. Sawyer stared at the grotesque display, heart hammering in his chest. "This wasn't just Ezekiel being insane," he said quietly. "This was planned." Repeated. Dr. Chen knelt beside the necklace and began carefully cataloging each tooth. "If any of these match Lucy's dental records, we'll know," she said. "But some of these don't look like hers. Some are from older children. One is even an adult molar. That hit harder than anything yet. More victims. Possibly many more." Sawyer called the sheriff that afternoon. "This is officially a serial case," he said. "And Ezekiel Marr?" the sheriff asked. "Still dead?" "Still dead. But the rope at the scene matches the rope in his belongings. Exact same brand, same knot style. Maritime. He knew what he was doing." "You're telling me the guy who hung himself in a hunting cabin was out here sacrificing children to the woods?" "I'm telling you," Sawyer replied, "he thought he was saving their souls." Back in town, Sawyer sat across from Martha Webb in the same police station where she'd reported her daughter missing 10 years ago. Her hands trembled as he gently placed the evidence bag on the table. Inside was the purple shoe, and next to it, a laminated photo of the necklace of teeth. "I'm so sorry," he said. Martha didn't cry. She just stared at the photo, then up at Sawyer. "Did they suffer?" "We don't think so," he lied. "The injuries suggest it was fast." She nodded once. Then looked down at Bandit, who sat beside her chair like a sentinel. "That dog," she whispered. "He brought my baby home." Sawyer's throat tightened. "Yes, ma'am. He did." That night, Sawyer drove back to the edge of the forest and parked near the trailhead. He and Bandit walked in silence, not far, just to the wooden marker where Sandra and Lucy were last seen. He placed 2 small bouquets on the ground. One pink, one blue. And beside them, he left the last item from the scene, a child's hand-drawn sketch, recovered from the sleeping bag. Faded, smeared, but still visible, a picture of a little girl holding hands with her mother, standing under a giant pine tree. A yellow sun smiled overhead. Sawyer looked at Bandit. "You found them," he said. "You did what no one else could." Bandit licked his hand once, then sat beside him. And together, they watched the sun go down, finally breaking through the trees, casting light on the place where it hadn't reached in over a decade. Sawyer stood frozen in the middle of the evidence room, the room eerily quiet except for the slow whir of the ventilation system. His gloved hands trembled as he held the nylon rope, a faded, weather-worn coil, but unmistakably identical to the cordage found at the burial site deep in the canyon. It wasn't just similar. It matched. Chemical analysis confirmed the rope's polymer composition, manufacturing year, and even the brand, Sterling Rope, used in climbing and rescue operations. But that wasn't the worst of it. Sawyer leaned in as the forensic technician showed him the lab's latest findings. There were microscopic skin cells on one of the preserved rope fibers, she said. We extracted partial DNA. And? Sawyer's voice was tight. It's a match to Lucy Webb's remains. Sawyer's jaw clenched. The air in the lab felt heavier now. 10 years of silence, of dead ends and dusty files, cracked open by a single dog's nose and a stretch of cord that someone never expected to resurface. Bandit, sitting at his handler's feet, whined softly as if he sensed the shift in energy. Sawyer dropped to one knee and scratched behind his ears. You did good, partner. Damn good. Later that afternoon, back in the precinct, Sawyer reopened the old box of Ezekiel Marr's personal journals, the ones he'd skimmed weeks earlier but hadn't dug into deeply. He now knew they weren't just ramblings from a recluse, they were something more dangerous. They were a blueprint. The August 2013 entries chilled him. August 3rd, I saw her again in the library. She understands purity. The girl radiates light. August 10th, the mother has agreed. She will bring the child to the woods. She seeks a better world for the little one. The ritual will come soon. August 17th, it is time. They walk the path now. The mother does not understand that salvation requires sacrifice. The girl must remain unspoiled, forever. Sawyer read the words aloud, his voice flat, even. Each syllable tasted metallic on his tongue. He pushed the journal aside, his knuckles pale against the oak desk. You sick bastard, he whispered. That evening, Sawyer stood in front of a whiteboard covered in red thread, printed maps, and post-it notes. It looked like something out of a crime show, but he didn't care. It made the chaos coherent. It showed a clear line, from the first meeting in the library to the final breath in the canyon. The journals made one thing clear: Sandra hadn't been abducted. She'd been convinced. Coaxed, manipulated, lured into trusting a man who disguised fanaticism as wisdom. Who dressed madness in the clothes of peace. She'd been searching for simplicity. A return to nature. A way to give her daughter a better life. And it had cost them both everything. The next morning, Sawyer received a call from the county coroner's office. The dental records had confirmed the final match. It's them, Dr. Chen said gently. Sandra and Lucy Webb. Sawyer nodded, silently. They're home now, she added. Thanks, Doc, he said and hung up. He didn't cry. Not right away. Instead, he stepped outside into the morning sun. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. A light breeze rolled down from the mountains. Bandit sat at attention beside the cruiser, tail thumping once when he saw Sawyer. Sawyer crouched and wrapped his arms around the dog's thick neck, pressing his face into the warm fur. Let's finish this, he said. The final sweep of the burial site had uncovered more than bones and rope. Hidden behind a split rock, Bandit had alerted on an old backpack, wrapped in a torn plastic sheet. Inside were children's items, colored pencils, a butterfly sticker album, and a weather-worn sketchbook filled with drawings. One sketch stood out, a crude crayon drawing of a man with long hair and a beard, standing beside a girl. Above their heads, Lucy had scrawled in shaky letters, Mr. Zeke's garden. Sawyer felt the breath leave his lungs. There was no longer any doubt, Lucy had known Ezekiel. She'd been drawing him. Days later, the official press release went public. The remains of Sandra and Lucy Webb, who went missing in 2013, were discovered in a remote section of Willamette National Forest. Evidence recovered confirms that the perpetrator was Ezekiel Marr, a deceased individual known for isolationist and extremist views. The case is now formally closed. The story made headlines across Oregon. Talk shows debated how someone could fall into cult-like belief systems so deeply. Social media exploded with theories. Some called Ezekiel a monster, others a symptom of societal neglect. But none of it mattered to Sawyer. What mattered was truth. And truth had finally come home. On the first Saturday of November, a funeral service was held in the Ashwood Community Cemetery. A modest crowd gathered, just a few townspeople, a former colleague of Sandra's, and Sawyer standing quietly off to the side, Bandit sitting beside him in full K9 vest. A small white headstone had been placed in the family plot. Sandra Webb. Beloved mother, seeker of light. Lucy Webb. Free spirit. Forever 11. Sawyer stepped forward last, holding a small object in his hand. The tooth necklace had been recovered from the crime scene, cleaned, and now sealed in a memorial box. Most of the teeth had yet to be identified. But 4 were Lucy's. Sawyer placed it gently on the grave. This was hers, he said. She deserves to rest whole. Bandit let out a soft whimper, nudging his handler's leg. That night, sitting on his back porch with a cold beer and Bandit curled at his feet, Sawyer stared out at the silhouette of the forest in the distance. So many had walked those trails, families, lovers, solo hikers, never knowing the truth that had festered just a few miles off path. Now, thanks to a dog's nose and sheer perseverance, that truth had been unearthed. Not every case ended in justice. But this one did. Even if it came a decade late. The late autumn sun burned through the fog just enough to cast long shadows over the Willamette Forest floor. Officer Sawyer adjusted his jacket as he stepped over a cluster of roots, Bandit trotting silently at his side. This was no longer about reopening a case. This was about closing a wound. They were headed toward a narrow ravine known only from Ezekiel Marr's hand-drawn map, labeled Hollow of Cleansing. Sawyer hated the name. It reeked of delusion. Of ritual. Of something that had no place in a world that was supposed to protect children, not sacrifice them. Bandit suddenly froze. His ears perked, head tilted. And then, his tail stiffened, nose to the ground. He had something. Go, boy, Sawyer whispered. Bandit took off like a shot, weaving through the brush, barking with urgency. Sawyer followed, heart hammering as adrenaline surged through his chest. Then he saw it. The ground dipped sharply into a narrow crevice between boulders. Bandit was standing at the edge, barking toward a large, jagged rock. Sawyer climbed down slowly, one hand gripping the stone wall, the other resting on the handle of his holstered pistol, not out of fear, but out of habit. He reached Bandit and immediately saw what had triggered the dog's reaction. Another bag. A faded purple backpack, wedged between 2 moss-covered stones. Its straps were torn. The fabric was shredded, but the butterfly patch stitched on the back was still there. Just like the one in the photo from the original report. He crouched and carefully pulled it out, heart sinking as he opened the zipper. Inside were crumbling school papers. A pink pencil case. A pack of crayons. And a drawing, smudged, damp, but still visible. A sketch of a girl and her mother holding hands under a tree. A dog stood next to them. The girl had labeled it, "Me, Mom, and a puppy we'll adopt one day." Sawyer clenched his jaw. Lucy. Back in town, the discovery reignited everything. DNA confirmed the remains found earlier were indeed Sandra and Lucy Webb. The journals retrieved from Ezekiel's cabin, along with the rope samples and hair follicles, tied him directly to the crime scene. But that wasn't all. Hidden in one of Ezekiel's old notebooks, beneath pages of ramblings about spiritual rebirth and purity through pain, was a detailed log. A schedule. Each year, he'd marked one specific weekend in August. And next to each date, a name. First names only. Female names. Ages. Lucy's name had been the last. There were 7 other names before hers. FBI forensic analysts were called in to investigate. Sawyer turned over the collar Bandit had discovered weeks earlier, threaded with 27 human teeth. Some belonged to Lucy. Others didn't match any known victims in Oregon's missing persons database. What that meant was chilling. Lucy wasn't Ezekiel's first victim. And she might not have been the last, had Bandit not picked up her scent 10 years later. It took months for all the pieces to come together, but when they did, the state attorney general issued a public statement. The Webb case was no longer classified as a missing persons investigation. It was now Oregon's first confirmed instance of a serial murder ritual rooted in fringe religious ideology. The town of Ashwood, stunned and grieving, rallied behind the surviving family. Martha Webb, Lucy's grandmother, stood at the small memorial service Sawyer helped organize at the Ashwood Cemetery. A modest crowd gathered beneath gray skies. No media. No podiums. Just a simple wooden casket containing what was left of Sandra and Lucy, buried side by side. Sawyer gave the eulogy. They didn't vanish. They didn't run. They were taken by someone who saw their kindness as weakness and their innocence as a target. But now, thanks to a dog who never gave up and a town that finally listened, they are no longer lost. Martha wept quietly, holding a folded drawing that Sawyer had laminated, the one Bandit found in the ravine. The department held a small ceremony a week later. Sawyer stood in uniform, hand resting on Bandit's collar as the mayor of Ashwood presented them both with medals. K9 Bandit, the mayor said, voice shaking, is not just a dog. He is a guardian. A truth seeker. And in many ways, our town's greatest hero. Bandit barked once, as if on cue. The crowd applauded. Sawyer, for once, allowed himself a small smile. But the real reward wasn't the plaque, or the media attention, or the commendations from the state. It was that quiet moment, 2 days later, when Sawyer took Bandit back to the forest, just the two of them, and laid a small bouquet of daisies at the base of the wooden trail sign where Sandra and Lucy were last seen. Justice came late, he murmured. But it came. Bandit sat beside him, calm and alert, eyes fixed on the trees. That night, Sawyer sat on his porch, sipping whiskey as Bandit snored at his feet. He stared at the sky. He'd chased 100 ghosts in his career. This time, he caught one. And maybe, just maybe, Emma, his own little girl, was somewhere watching, proud that her dad still knew how to bring someone home. Even if it took 10 years and a damn good dog to do it. Thank you for following this journey. Not every case gets solved. Not every mystery gets answers. But some do, when we refuse to forget, when we keep asking questions, and when we trust those with instincts sharper than our own. Do you believe that dogs can sense what we can't? Let us know in the comments below. Backhand index pointing down.